Some cases never leave you. They follow you home, sit at your dinner table, and whisper in the dark corners of your mind when you're trying to sleep. The Tommy Blake case is one of those. I've been investigating cold cases for over 30 years, but this one changed everything I thought I knew about my own hometown. It started with a camera, a simple beat-up Polaroid camera that Aaron Blake bought for $12 at Murphy's Pawnshop on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October 2004. Aaron wasn't looking for anything in particular that day. He was just killing time, the way lonely people do when they can't bear to go home to an empty house. He was 37 then, a high school history teacher who lived alone in the same small Oklahoma town where he'd grown up, the same town where his little brother Tommy had vanished 21 years earlier. Aaron had been browsing the dusty shelves of Murphy's for about an hour when the camera caught his eye. It was an old Polaroid one-step, the kind that had been popular in the early 80s. The brown leather case was cracked and faded, but something about it drew him in. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was the way the autumn light hit the lens just right. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something he couldn't name but felt deep in his bones. When he picked up the camera, he noticed it had weight to it, more weight than it should have had if it were empty. Aaron opened the back and found what he was looking for, an old film cartridge still loaded. Half the shots had been taken, but the other half remained, waiting in the darkness for over 2 decades. The pawnshop owner, Murphy himself, was a grizzled man in his 70s who'd seen everything come and go through his shop. When Aaron asked about the camera, Murphy just shrugged. "Found it in a storage unit auction last month," he said, scratching his grey beard. "Unit belonged to some photographer who died a few years back. Family didn't want any of his old equipment." Murphy paused, studying Aaron's face. "You look familiar. You're one of the Blake boys, aren't you?" Aaron nodded, though he hated being called that. He'd been one of the Blake boys his whole life, even after Tommy disappeared. Especially after Tommy disappeared. In a small town like theirs, tragedy becomes part of your identity. You carry it like a scar that everyone can see but no one talks about directly. "I remember when your little brother went missing," Murphy continued, his voice softer now. "Terrible thing. Just terrible. Your parents never got over it, did they?" Aaron's jaw tightened. His parents had died within 2 years of each other, just 5 years after Tommy's disappearance. His mother from cancer, his father from what the doctors called a heart attack, but what Aaron knew was really a broken heart. They'd spent their final years searching, hoping, waiting for a phone call that never came. "No," Aaron said quietly. "They never did." He paid for the camera and walked out into the October drizzle, not knowing that he was carrying more than just an old piece of photography equipment. He was carrying the key to the darkest secret his hometown had ever kept. That night, Aaron sat at his kitchen table staring at the camera. He'd been thinking about Tommy a lot lately. The anniversary of his disappearance was coming up in a few weeks, and like every year, Aaron would visit the cemetery where his parents were buried and leave flowers on the empty grave they'd bought for Tommy. An empty grave for a boy who might still be alive somewhere, or might be buried in an unmarked plot miles away from home. Tommy had been 7 when he disappeared, 7 years old, with gap-toothed grin and freckles across his nose, and an insatiable curiosity about everything. He'd been the kind of kid who asked a million questions and never seemed to run out of energy. Aaron had been 18 then, fresh out of high school and full of his own problems. He'd been dating Sarah Mitchell, working part-time at the hardware store, and dreaming of college. He'd thought he was too old to babysit his little brother at the county fair. The Blake family had gone to the fair together that Saturday afternoon in September 1983. It was an annual tradition, something they'd done every year since Aaron could remember. Their parents loved the fair, the livestock competitions, the pie contests, the community feeling of it all. Aaron had been sulking because he'd wanted to spend the day with Sarah instead, and Tommy had been bouncing off the walls with excitement about the rides and the games. The fair was crowded that year, more crowded than usual. The weather had been perfect, and it seemed like half the county had shown up. Aaron remembered the smells, corn dogs and cotton candy, diesel fuel from the generators, and the earthy scent of the animal barns. He remembered the sounds, the screams from the tilt-a-whirl, the barkers calling out from the game booths, and the constant chatter of hundreds of voices mixing together. His mother had been nervous about the crowds. She'd made Aaron promise to keep an eye on Tommy, especially near the rides. "He's so small," she'd said. "He could get lost so easily in all these people." Aaron had rolled his eyes and promised. but his heart wasn't in it. He'd been scanning the crowd for Sarah, hoping to catch a glimpse of her blonde hair or hear her laugh over the noise. They'd been at the fair for maybe 2 hours when it happened. Aaron had been waiting in line for the Ferris wheel with Tommy, but the line was long and moving slowly. Tommy had spotted the ring toss game across the midway and had begged to go play. Aaron had been annoyed by the delay, eager to get on the ride and get the day over with. So he'd given Tommy a $5 bill and told him to go ahead, that he'd catch up in a minute. "Stay where I can see you," Aaron had called after him. But Tommy was already running toward the game booth, weaving through the crowd like a fish swimming upstream. Aaron had watched him go, then turned back to the Ferris wheel line, checking his watch and wondering if Sarah would be at the dance later that night. When Aaron looked back toward the ring toss booth 3 minutes later, Tommy was gone. At first, Aaron wasn't worried. Tommy was probably just distracted by another game, or had wandered over to look at the horses in the barn. Aaron had left the Ferris wheel line and walked over to the ring toss booth, expecting to find his little brother there, but the booth operator, a thin man with greasy hair and yellowed teeth, said he hadn't seen any little boy matching Tommy's description. Aaron had started calling Tommy's name then, moving through the crowd with growing urgency. He'd checked the pony rides, the game booths, the food stands. He'd even looked in the portable restrooms, thinking maybe Tommy had gotten sick from too much cotton candy. But there was no sign of him anywhere. By the time Aaron found his parents and told them Tommy was missing, 20 minutes had passed. By the time they'd organized a search party, it had been an hour. By the time the police arrived, it had been 2 hours, and the fair was starting to wind down for the evening. The search had gone on for days. Volunteers had combed through every acre of the fairgrounds, every ditch along the highway, every abandoned building in the county. The police had questioned everyone who'd been working the fair, every vendor and ride operator and game booth attendant. They'd put Tommy's picture on milk cartons and posted flyers on telephone poles from Oklahoma City to Tulsa, but they'd found nothing. No trace of Tommy Blake, no clues about what had happened to him, no witnesses who remembered seeing him after that last moment when Aaron had watched him run toward the ring toss booth. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. The case had officially remained open, but after 6 months the active investigation had quietly wound down. The detective assigned to the case, a decent man named Frank Morrison, had told Aaron's parents that cases like this usually resolved themselves quickly if they were going to resolve at all. "If we don't find him in the first few weeks," Morrison had said gently, "chances are we're not going to find him." Aaron had blamed himself from the beginning. If he'd stayed with Tommy, if he'd kept his promise to their mother, if he'd been paying attention instead of thinking about Sarah Mitchell and the school dance, maybe things would have been different. Maybe Tommy would have grown up to be a man, would have had a family of his own, would have been sitting around the dinner table with Aaron every Thanksgiving. Instead, Aaron had spent the last 21 years living with the weight of that moment, that split second when he'd chosen his own desires over his responsibility to his little brother. He'd become a teacher, partly because of that guilt, thinking that maybe if he could protect other people's children, he could somehow make up for failing to protect his own brother. Now, sitting in his kitchen with the old camera in his hands, Aaron felt that familiar ache in his chest. The same ache he'd carried for more than 2 decades, the same questions that had never been answered. Where had Tommy gone? What had happened to him? Was he still alive somewhere, or had he died that night, alone and afraid? Aaron had taken photography classes in college, back when he'd thought he might become a journalist instead of a teacher. He knew how to develop film, knew how to work in a darkroom. He had all the equipment he needed in the basement of his house, left over from a hobby he'd abandoned years ago when the memories became too painful. He decided to develop the film. He told himself it was just curiosity, just a way to see what kind of pictures some dead photographer had taken 20 years ago. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was hope, the kind of desperate hope that had kept his parents searching long after everyone else had given up. The darkroom in Aaron's basement was small and cramped, but it had everything he needed. He'd set it up when he'd first moved into the house, thinking he might take up photography again as a way to fill the empty hours. But every time he'd tried to use it, he'd been overwhelmed by memories of Tommy, who'd loved to watch Aaron develop pictures when they were kids. Aaron worked carefully in the red light of the darkroom, his hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through his body. He removed the film cartridge from the camera and began the development process, each step bringing him closer to whatever secrets the film might hold. The first few images were disappointing. Pictures of a sunset, a dog playing in a yard, someone's birthday party, the kind of casual snapshots that filled photo albums in houses across America. Aaron began to think he'd been foolish to hope for anything more significant, but then he came to the fifth photograph, and his world stopped. It was a picture of a county fair. Not just any county fair, but his county fair. He recognized the Ferris wheel, the layout of the game booths, the distinctive red and white striped tent that had housed the livestock competitions. This was the Blanchard County Fair, and based on the clothing and hairstyles of the people in the background, it had been taken sometime in the early 1980s. Aaron's hands began to shake as he moved to the next image. Another fair picture, this one showing the midway from a different angle. Then another and another. Someone had been taking pictures at the fair, probably the same fair where Tommy had disappeared. The eighth photograph made Aaron's knees buckle. He had to grab the edge of the developing table to keep from falling, because there, in the background of a shot that seemed to focus on the ring toss booth, was a small boy with dark hair and a red t-shirt, a boy who looked exactly like Tommy. Aaron's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep working. Maybe it wasn't Tommy. Maybe it was just another kid who happened to look similar. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, seeing what he wanted to see rather than what was actually there. But the ninth photograph removed all doubt. It was a closer shot, clearly showing the ring toss booth and the people around it. And standing at the booth, concentrating on the game with the serious expression Aaron remembered so well, was Tommy Blake. 7 years old, wearing the red Oklahoma Sooners t-shirt their father had bought him for his birthday, with the same cowlick in his hair that their mother had tried unsuccessfully to tame that morning. Aaron stared at the photograph for a long time, tears streaming down his face. Here was proof that Tommy had made it to the ring toss booth that day, just as Aaron had told the police. But more than that, here was the last known photograph of his little brother alive. Aaron wiped his eyes and moved to the 10th and final photograph on the film. This one was different from the others. It was taken from closer to the booth, and the angle suggested the photographer had been crouching down or hiding behind something. The focus was still on the ring toss game, but now Aaron could see more details. Tommy was still there, but he wasn't alone. Standing next to him, with one hand on Tommy's shoulder, was a man Aaron didn't recognize. The man was tall and thin, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was leaning down, saying something to Tommy, and Tommy was looking up at him with the trusting expression of a child talking to a friendly adult. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that made Aaron's skin crawl. The man's grip on Tommy's shoulder looked too tight, too possessive, and Tommy's expression, when Aaron looked closer, wasn't just trusting. It was confused, maybe even a little frightened. Aaron studied the man's face, what he could see of it under the baseball cap. The features were sharp, angular, with deep-set eyes and a thin mouth. He looked to be in his 30s or early 40s, average height but with broad shoulders. There was something familiar about him, something that nagged at the back of Aaron's mind, but he couldn't quite place it. He made copies of all the photographs, especially the last one. Then he sat in his kitchen until dawn, staring at that final image and trying to remember everything he could about that day, 21 years ago. Who had been at the fair? Who had been working the game booths? Who had access to the fairgrounds? And most importantly, who was the man in the baseball cap and what had he done with Tommy Blake? Aaron knew he should take the photographs to the police, should let them handle the investigation. But Detective Morrison had retired years ago, and the current sheriff, Bill Hawkins, had been just a deputy back in 1983. Aaron wasn't sure Hawkins would take him seriously, wasn't sure anyone would believe that a camera bought at a pawn shop could hold the key to a 21-year-old mystery. So Aaron decided to do some investigating on his own first. He was a history teacher, after all. He knew how to research, how to dig through old records and piece together the past. And he had something the police had never had, a photograph of the man who might have taken his brother. As the sun rose over the small town of Blanchard, Oklahoma, Aaron Blake made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out who that man was, and he was going to learn the truth about what happened to Tommy, no matter what it cost him. What Aaron didn't know as he sat there planning his investigation was that he was about to uncover something far more sinister than a single kidnapping, something that would shake the foundations of his quiet hometown and force him to question everything he thought he knew about the people he'd grown up around. The man in the baseball cap was just the beginning. Aaron Blake didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy's face in that photograph, saw the confusion in his little brother's expression as the stranger leaned down to speak to him. By morning, Aaron had made a list of everything he could remember about the 1983 county fair, every person who might have information, every lead he could possibly follow. The first person he decided to talk to was Margaret Fielding. She had been the fair coordinator for over 15 years back then, and as far as Aaron knew, she was still alive and living in the same house on Maple Street where she'd raised her own children. If anyone would remember the details about who had been working the fair that year, it would be Margaret. Aaron found her in her garden, tending to the roses that had won blue ribbons at the county fair every year since the 1970s. She was in her 80s now, but her mind was still sharp, and she remembered Aaron immediately. "Aaron Blake," she said, straightening up and brushing the dirt from her gardening gloves. "I heard you were teaching over at the high school now. Your parents would be so proud." Her expression softened. "I still think about Tommy sometimes. Such a sweet little boy. I always hoped—" "That's actually why I'm here, Mrs. Fielding," Aaron said. "I found something. Something that might be connected to Tommy's disappearance." Margaret's eyes widened as Aaron showed her the photographs. She studied them carefully, holding them at arm's length and then closer, adjusting her glasses to get a better look. "My goodness," she whispered. "This is definitely our fair. I remember that banner behind the ring toss booth. We only used that design for 2 years before the wind tore it up." She looked up at Aaron. "Where did you get these?" Aaron explained about the camera, about developing the film, about the man in the baseball cap who seemed to be leading Tommy away from the booth. Margaret listened intently, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "I remember that booth," she said finally. "The ring toss was always popular with the children. But Aaron, I have to tell you something. That booth wasn't run by one of our regular vendors that year." Aaron felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "Well, usually we had the same people year after year. The Hendersons ran the ring toss for almost a decade. But that year, 1983, Mr. Henderson was in the hospital with his heart condition. We had to find a replacement at the last minute." Margaret frowned, clearly struggling to remember. "It was someone local, someone who volunteered to help out. But for the life of me, I can't remember who it was." "There must be records," Aaron said. "Applications, insurance forms, something." Margaret nodded slowly. "There should be. We kept everything in those days. Had to, for insurance purposes. The records would be in the town hall basement, in the archives. Though I have to warn you, it's not exactly organized down there. 20 years of paperwork, all stuffed into boxes." Aaron spent the rest of that day in the basement of the Blanchard Town Hall, surrounded by moldy cardboard boxes and the musty smell of old paper. The town clerk, a woman named Linda who'd gone to high school with Aaron, had given him permission to search through the archives, though she'd warned him that finding anything specific would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. She was right. The boxes were labeled by year, but within each box the papers seemed to have been thrown in randomly. Aaron found vendor applications mixed in with livestock registration forms, insurance documents buried under parking permits, and receipts for everything from porta potties to generator rentals. But Aaron was nothing if not persistent. Teaching high school had given him patience, and the guilt he'd carried for 21 years had given him determination. He worked methodically through box after box, creating piles of potentially relevant documents and setting aside everything else. It was nearly closing time when he found it. A single sheet of paper, yellowed with age and partially torn along one edge. It was a vendor application for the ring toss booth, dated just 2 weeks before the 1983 fair. The handwriting was messy, almost illegible, but Aaron could make out most of the information. The applicant's name was listed as Robert Kellerman. The address was a rural route outside of town. Under previous experience, someone had written, "Volunteer various community events." The application was signed at the bottom, though the signature was just as messy as the rest of the handwriting. Aaron stared at the name, Robert Kellerman. It didn't ring any bells, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Blanchard County had a population of over 30,000 people back then, and Aaron had been 18 and self-absorbed, not paying attention to adults he didn't know personally. He made copies of the application and a few other documents that seemed potentially relevant, then drove home to start his real research. If Robert Kellerman had lived in Blanchard County in 1983, there would be records of him somewhere. Property records, voter registrations, maybe even old phone books. Aaron's laptop was old and slow, but it got the job done. He started with the county clerk's online records, searching for any mention of Robert Kellerman. What he found made his blood run cold. Robert Kellerman had owned a small farm about 15 miles outside of Blanchard from 1979 to 1985. According to the property records, he'd sold the farm in early 1985 and left no forwarding address. But it was the other information that made Aaron's hands shake as he typed. In 1984, just 1 year after Tommy's disappearance, Robert Kellerman had been questioned by police in connection with another missing child case. A 10-year-old girl named Susan Martinez had vanished from a church carnival in the next county over. She'd been there with her family, playing games and eating cotton candy, when she'd simply disappeared, just like Tommy. The police report was brief and mostly redacted in the online version, but Aaron could see enough to understand the basics. Kellerman had been questioned because someone had seen him talking to Susan shortly before she disappeared, but he'd had an alibi. He claimed he'd been at home all evening and a neighbor had corroborated his story. Susan Martinez had never been found. Her case, like Tommy's, had eventually gone cold. Aaron spent the rest of the night searching for more information about Robert Kellerman, but the trail seemed to end in 1985. No forwarding address, no subsequent property purchases, no voter registrations in Oklahoma. It was as if the man had simply vanished, just like the children he might have taken. But Aaron wasn't ready to give up. The next morning, he called in sick to work and drove out to the rural route where Kellerman's farm had been located. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find after all these years, but he had to see the place for himself. The farm was about 20 minutes outside of town, down a winding country road that Aaron remembered traveling as a child when his family would go to the lake for picnics. The property was easy to spot. It was the only abandoned house on that stretch of road, sitting back from the highway behind a rusted mailbox and a gate that hung open on broken hinges. Aaron parked his car on the shoulder and walked up the overgrown driveway. The house was small and run down, with boarded-up windows and a roof that had partially collapsed. The barn behind it was in even worse shape, its red paint faded to a dull brown and its doors hanging askew. But it was the cellar that caught Aaron's attention. The entrance was around the back of the house, covered by 2 wooden doors that were chained shut. The chains were old and rusted, but they were still intact. Aaron walked around the perimeter of the cellar looking for another way in, and found a small window that had been broken years ago. The window was too small for Aaron to fit through, but he could shine his phone's flashlight through the opening and get a glimpse of what was inside. What he saw made his stomach turn. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, extending under most of the house. The walls were concrete, and the floor was dirt. But along one wall, Aaron could see what looked like a series of small rooms or cells, each one separated by wooden partitions. The spaces were tiny, barely large enough for a child to lie down in. Aaron's hands were shaking as he tried to get a better angle with his phone's light. In one of the cells, he could see what looked like a small mattress, rotted and moldy after years of abandonment. In another, there were what might have been toys, a teddy bear, some building blocks, things that would have belonged to a child. Aaron backed away from the window and called the police. He knew he should have called them sooner, should have turned over the photographs and the vendor application, and let them handle the investigation from the beginning. But now he had no choice. What he'd found in that cellar was evidence of something far worse than a single kidnapping. Sheriff Bill Hawkins arrived at the farm 30 minutes later, along with 2 deputies and a state police investigator named Janet Reynolds, who specialized in cold cases. Aaron explained everything: the camera, the photographs, the vendor application, and what he'd seen in the cellar. Reynolds was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She listened to Aaron's story without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but never expressing skepticism. When he was finished, she nodded grimly. "We'll need to get a warrant to search the property," she said. "But based on what you've told me, I think we have probable cause. This is good work, Mr. Blake. Really good work." The search warrant came through the next day, and Aaron was allowed to observe as the investigators broke the chains on the cellar doors and descended into what they would later describe as a chamber of horrors. The cellar was everything Aaron had glimpsed through the broken window and more. 6 small cells, each one equipped with a mattress, a bucket, and a few toys, clearly meant to keep a child calm and quiet. The walls were covered with scratches and drawings, the desperate marks of children who had been held captive in the darkness. But it was what they found in the 7th cell that broke Aaron's heart. A small red t-shirt, faded, but still recognizable as an Oklahoma Sooners shirt. The same shirt Tommy had been wearing the day he disappeared. Reynolds carefully bagged the shirt as evidence, her expression grim. "We'll need to run DNA tests," she told Aaron. "But this looks promising. Or as promising as something this horrible can look." The investigation moved quickly after that. Within a week, the state police had excavated the entire cellar and the surrounding property. They found remains, not complete skeletons, but fragments, pieces of bone and clothing that suggested multiple victims over several years. The forensic anthropologist who examined the remains estimated that they belonged to at least 4 different children, ranging in age from about 6 to 12 years old. The condition of the bones suggested they had been buried for many years, probably dating back to the early 1980s. Aaron tried to prepare himself for the possibility that one of those sets of remains might belong to Tommy, but the DNA testing would take weeks to complete. In the meantime, Reynolds and her team focused on tracking down Robert Kellerman. The trail led them across 3 states and back more than 20 years. Kellerman, they discovered, had been using multiple identities since leaving Oklahoma in 1985. He'd worked at carnivals and state fairs across the Midwest and South, always in positions that gave him access to children, always moving on before anyone could get too close. In Missouri, he'd been Robert Kelly. In Arkansas, he'd been Bob Kerman. In Texas, he'd been Roy Keller. Each identity was carefully constructed with forged documents and stolen Social Security numbers. Each time he moved, he left behind another trail of missing children and grieving families. But the investigators were good at their job and they were patient. They followed the trail of fake identities and suspicious disappearances, building a case that stretched across multiple jurisdictions and more than 2 decades. They found him in a small town in Louisiana, working as a maintenance man at an elementary school. He was 63 years old now, his hair gray and thinning, his face lined with age. But Aaron recognized him immediately from the old photographs the police showed him. The same sharp features, the same cold eyes, the same thin mouth that had been hidden under a baseball cap at the county fair 21 years ago. Robert Kellerman, a.k.a. Robert Kelly, a.k.a. Bob Kerman, a.k.a. Roy Keller, was arrested on a Tuesday morning in November 2004. He didn't resist, didn't try to run, didn't even seem surprised when the police came for him. According to the arresting officers, he just nodded when they read him his rights, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. Aaron was in his classroom when he got the call from Reynolds. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone as she told him about the arrest. After 21 years of wondering, of hoping, of carrying the guilt and the questions, they finally had answers. But Reynolds' next words reminded Aaron that some answers only lead to more questions. "He's talking," she said. "Kellerman is talking. And Mr. Blake, what he's telling us, it's bigger than we thought. Much bigger." Aaron sat down heavily in his desk chair, surrounded by the familiar chaos of his classroom, student papers to grade, lesson plans to write, the normal concerns of a high school teacher, but nothing felt normal anymore. Nothing would ever feel normal again. "What do you mean, bigger?" he asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Reynolds was quiet for a moment, and Aaron could hear voices in the background, other investigators talking in urgent, hushed tones. "Kellerman says he wasn't working alone," Reynolds said finally. "He says there were others involved, other people who helped him take the children, who knew what he was doing, people here in Blanchard, people who are still here." Aaron felt the world tilt around him. "Who?" he whispered. "He's giving us names," Reynolds said. "Important names. People you know, people everyone in town knows. This isn't just about one man and his sick obsession, Mr. Blake. This is about a network, a group of people who were working together." Aaron thought about his quiet hometown, about the people he'd grown up with, the families he'd known his entire life. He thought about the teachers he worked with, the parents of his students, the shopkeepers and police officers and city council members who made up the fabric of his community. "When will you make the arrests?" he asked. "Soon," Reynolds said. "But Aaron, I need to warn you about something. When this story breaks, when people find out what we've discovered, it's going to tear your town apart. Some of these names, they're going to shock people. And there are going to be people who don't want the truth to come out, people who have a lot to lose if Kellerman keeps talking. Aaron closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what was coming. He'd wanted answers about Tommy, had been willing to do whatever it took to find out what happened to his little brother, but he was beginning to understand that the truth was going to cost him more than he'd ever imagined. "Are you telling me I might be in danger?" he asked. Reynolds's pause lasted just a fraction too long. "I'm telling you to be careful," she said finally. "Very careful. You're the one who started this investigation, the one who found the evidence that broke the case open. There are going to be people who wish you'd left that camera in the pawn shop." After Reynolds hung up, Aaron sat alone in his empty classroom for a long time. Outside, he could hear the sounds of a normal day in a normal town. Cars driving past the school, children playing in the nearby park, life continuing as it always had. But Aaron knew that normalcy was about to end. In a few days, maybe a few hours, the carefully constructed facade of his hometown was going to crumble. And when it did, he was going to learn just how deep the darkness went, and how many people he'd trusted had been living lies. What Aaron didn't know, as he sat there trying to process what Reynolds had told him, was that someone was already watching him. Someone who had been watching him since the day he'd walked out of Murphy's pawn shop with that old camera. Someone who knew exactly what was in those photographs, and who would do anything to make sure the truth never came to light. The first sign that Aaron was being watched came 3 days after Kellerman's arrest. It was a small thing, something most people would have dismissed as coincidence or paranoia. But Aaron had been living on edge since his conversation with Reynolds, and he'd developed the kind of hypervigilance that comes with knowing you've made dangerous enemies. He was leaving the grocery store when he noticed the man in the blue pickup truck. The truck was parked across the street, engine running, and the driver seemed to be reading a newspaper. But Aaron caught him looking up just as Aaron loaded his groceries into his car, and there was something about the man's quick glance away that felt wrong. Aaron had seen the same truck earlier that day, parked outside the school when he'd left work. And the day before, he was almost certain he'd seen it in the parking lot at Murphy's pawn shop, when he'd gone back to ask Murphy more questions about the camera. That night, Aaron called Reynolds to report his suspicions. She listened carefully, asked a few questions about the truck and the driver, then told him something that made his blood run cold. "Someone broke into Kellerman's old farm last night," she said. "Cut through the police tape, damaged some of the evidence we hadn't finished processing yet. It looked like they were searching for something specific." Aaron felt his stomach drop. What kind of something? Hard to say, but they went straight to the cellar, straight to the areas where we'd found the most evidence. This wasn't random vandalism, Aaron. Someone was looking for something they thought we might have missed. Reynolds assigned a state police officer to drive by Aaron's house periodically, but she couldn't provide round-the-clock protection without more concrete evidence that he was in danger. "Just be smart," she told him. "Don't go anywhere alone at night. Don't follow any predictable routines, and call me immediately if you see anything suspicious." Aaron tried to follow her advice, but it was hard to act natural when you felt like you were being hunted. He varied his route to work, shopped at different stores, even started parking in different spots in the school parking lot. But the feeling of being watched never went away. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Reynolds called Aaron on a Friday afternoon with news that changed everything they thought they knew about the scope of the conspiracy. "Kellerman gave us another name," she said without preamble. "Someone who's still alive, still living in Blanchard. We're going to arrest him tonight." Aaron's heart was pounding. "Who is it?" "Dale Murphy, the pawn shop owner." Aaron felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Murphy, the grizzled old man who'd sold him the camera, who'd remembered Tommy's disappearance, who'd seemed genuinely sympathetic. The man who'd had access to evidence for over 20 years and had chosen to keep it hidden. "How long has he been involved?" Aaron asked. "According to Kellerman, since the beginning. Murphy wasn't just selling the camera by coincidence, Aaron. He knew exactly what was on that film. Kellerman says Murphy was the one who took the photographs, that he was documenting their activities." Aaron felt sick. He thought about Murphy's reaction when he'd bought the camera, the way the old man had seemed to recognize him, had brought up Tommy's disappearance without being asked. Had Murphy been testing him somehow? Had he wanted Aaron to find the photographs? "There's more," Reynolds continued. "Murphy's been collecting evidence for decades. Souvenirs from the children they took. We found a storage unit registered under a false name, filled with photographs, clothing, toys, things that belonged to victims going back to the early 1970s. The scope of it was staggering. Aaron had thought they were dealing with a few years of crimes, maybe a handful of victims. But if Reynolds was right, this network had been operating for over 30 years, taking children from county fairs and carnivals across multiple states. "How many victims are we talking about?" Aaron asked. "We're still counting, but based on what we've found so far, we think there could be dozens, maybe more." Aaron had to sit down. Dozens of children, dozens of families who'd never gotten answers, never learned what happened to their sons and daughters. All of it covered up by a network of people who'd managed to hide their crimes for over 3 decades. "Who else?" Aaron asked. "Murphy and Kellerman can't have done this alone. Who else was involved?" Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Kellerman is talking, but he's being strategic about it. He's giving us information in pieces, probably hoping to negotiate a better deal. And Murphy, well, Murphy's not saying anything." The arrest of Dale Murphy sent shockwaves through Blanchard. Murphy had been a fixture in the community for over 40 years, had served on the city council, had been a deacon at the Baptist church. People knew him, trusted him, brought their children into his store. Aaron watched the news coverage from his living room, seeing the familiar faces of his neighbors and former classmates as they were interviewed about Murphy's arrest. Everyone expressed shock, disbelief, anger. No one could believe that kindly old Dale Murphy could be involved in something so horrible. But Aaron noticed something else in the interviews, something that made his skin crawl. There were people who seemed more angry than shocked, more defensive than disbelieving. People who seemed less concerned about the victims than about the damage to the town's reputation. Mayor Richard Blackwood was particularly vocal in his criticism of the investigation. "This is a witch hunt," he told the local news reporter. "Dale Murphy is a pillar of this community, and these accusations are based on the word of a confessed child killer. We need to be very careful about destroying good people's lives based on unsubstantiated claims." City Council member Patricia Hendricks echoed the mayor's sentiments. "I've known Dale Murphy for 25 years, she said. "The idea that he could be involved in something like this is absolutely ridiculous. Someone needs to ask some hard questions about why these state police investigators are so eager to believe a criminal's lies." Aaron found their reactions troubling. These were people who should have been horrified by the evidence, should have been demanding answers and justice for the victims. Instead, they seemed more interested in protecting Murphy's reputation than uncovering the truth. That weekend, Aaron decided to do some investigating of his own. If there really was a network of people involved in the crimes, if Murphy and Kellerman had been working with others, then there might be more evidence hidden in plain sight. He started with the obvious place, Murphy's pawnshop. The police had searched it thoroughly and seized boxes of evidence, but the building was still standing, still accessible. Aaron knew he couldn't get inside legally, but he could observe from outside, maybe notice something the investigators had missed. The shop was closed, of course, with police tape across the door and a notice about the ongoing investigation. But as Aaron sat in his car across the street watching the building, he noticed something interesting. Despite the late hour and the obvious police presence, people kept driving by slowly, obviously looking at the building. Some of them Aaron recognized. Dr. James Fletcher, who'd been the family physician for half the town for over 20 years. Carl Brennan, who owned the largest construction company in the county. Even Police Chief Tom Bradley, who should have had no reason to be cruising past a sealed crime scene on a Saturday night. Aaron started taking notes, writing down license plate numbers and times. He didn't know if any of these people were involved in the crimes, but their behavior was suspicious enough to warrant attention. On Sunday, Aaron decided to visit the cemetery where his parents were buried. He went there often, especially when he was struggling with difficult decisions or overwhelming emotions. It was a peaceful place, and he found that being near his parents helped him think more clearly. He was kneeling beside their headstone, cleaning away some fallen leaves when he heard footsteps behind him. Aaron turned to see Chief Bradley approaching, his expression unreadable. "Aaron," Bradley said, nodding in greeting. "I thought I might find you here." Aaron stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. Bradley was a big man, over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, and the kind of presence that commanded respect. He'd been police chief for almost 15 years, and before that he'd been a deputy under the old sheriff. Aaron had known him peripherally for years, but they'd never been close. "Chief," Aaron said carefully, "what can I do for you?" Bradley looked around the cemetery as if making sure they were alone. "I wanted to talk to you about this investigation," he said finally. about the questions you've been asking, the attention you've been bringing to our town." Aaron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." Bradley's voice was still friendly, but there was an undertone that made Aaron's pulse quicken. "You've been very busy since you found that camera. Talking to Margaret Fielding, digging through old records, bringing in state investigators. Some people think you're stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any." "Some people?" Aaron asked. "Or you?" Bradley smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let me be clear about something, Aaron. Dale Murphy is a good man who's being railroaded by overzealous investigators and the lies of a convicted child killer. This witch hunt you've started is tearing apart a good community, hurting innocent people." Aaron felt anger rising in his chest. "Innocent people? Chief, they found evidence of multiple murders, children's remains. How can you call anyone involved in that innocent?" "Because I know Dale Murphy," Bradley said, his voice harder now. "I've known him for 20 years, and I know this town. These wild accusations, these conspiracy theories about networks and cover-ups, they're nonsense. You're destroying people's lives based on the fantasies of a sick man." Aaron stared at Bradley, trying to read the expression behind his sunglasses. There was something in the chief's tone, something in his body language, that suggested this conversation was more than just a friendly warning. "Are you telling me to stop cooperating with the investigation?" Aaron asked. Bradley was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the cemetery. "I'm telling you that sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie," he said finally. "Sometimes digging up the past just causes more pain for everyone involved. Even if the past includes the murder of my brother?" Bradley turned back to Aaron, and for a moment his mask slipped. There was something cold in his eyes, something that made Aaron take a step backward. "Your brother disappeared 21 years ago," Bradley said slowly. "Nothing you do now is going to bring him back. But you could destroy a lot of good people in the process of trying." With that, Bradley turned and walked away, leaving Aaron standing alone among the headstones. Aaron watched him go, his mind racing. The conversation had felt like a threat, though Bradley had been careful not to say anything explicitly threatening. But Aaron was beginning to understand that Chief Bradley might be more than just a skeptical law enforcement officer. The way he'd spoken about Murphy, the way he'd tried to discourage Aaron from cooperating with the investigation, the way he'd seemed to know exactly where to find Aaron on a Sunday afternoon, it all suggested that Bradley might have more personal stake in protecting Murphy than professional duty would require. That night, Aaron called Reynolds and told her about the conversation with Bradley. She listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about exactly what the chief had said. "We've been wondering about local law enforcement," she said when Aaron finished. "This kind of operation, lasting this long, involving this many victims, it would be almost impossible without some kind of official protection. Someone in authority would have had to look the other way, maybe even actively help cover things up." Aaron felt sick. The idea that the police chief might be involved, might have been protecting the network for years, was almost too horrible to contemplate. How many investigations had been derailed? How many leads had been ignored? How many families had been denied justice because the person they trusted to protect them was working for the other side? "What do we do now?" Aaron asked. "We be very careful," Reynolds said. "If Bradley is involved, then he knows exactly what we're doing, knows what evidence we have, knows what Kellerman is telling us. We're going to have to assume that anything we tell local law enforcement will get back to the wrong people." Aaron hung up, feeling more isolated and frightened than ever. If he couldn't trust the police, if the very people who were supposed to protect him might be working against him, then he was truly on his own. But he wasn't ready to give up. Tommy deserved justice, and so did all the other children who'd been taken over the years. Aaron had started this investigation, had opened this can of worms, and he was going to see it through to the end. What he didn't know was that the end was coming much sooner than he'd expected, and that the final revelations would be more shocking than anything he'd discovered so far. The next morning, Aaron found a note slipped under his front door. It was handwritten in block letters, obviously disguised, "Stop digging or join your brother." Aaron stared at the note for a long time, his hands shaking. Someone had been to his house during the night, had walked right up to his door while he was sleeping. Someone who knew where he lived, who wasn't afraid to make their threat explicit. Aaron called Reynolds immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried the state police headquarters, but they told him Reynolds was in court and wouldn't be available until later in the day. Feeling more alone than ever, Aaron made a decision that would change everything. He was going to confront the people he suspected of being involved, was going to force them to show their hand. It was dangerous, probably stupid, but he couldn't keep living in fear. And besides, he had one advantage that the network didn't know about yet. Murphy hadn't been the only person taking photographs all those years ago. Aaron had found something else in the town hall archives, something he hadn't told Reynolds about yet, something that was going to blow the case wide open and expose everyone who'd been involved in the cover-up. But first, he had to make sure he lived long enough to reveal it. The second piece of evidence Aaron had found in the town hall archives was a photographer's contact sheet from the 1983 county fair. It had been buried in a box of miscellaneous documents, probably overlooked because it looked like just another piece of fair memorabilia. But when Aaron held it up to the light and studied it carefully, he realized what he was looking at. It was a contact sheet showing dozens of small photographs, all taken at the fair over the course of that weekend. Most were innocent shots of families enjoying the rides, couples sharing funnel cake, children playing games. But scattered throughout were other images that told a different story. Aaron could see Kellerman in several of the shots, always in the background, always watching children. In one photograph, he was talking to a little girl near the pony rides. In another, he was standing behind a group of boys waiting in line for the haunting house. And in a third, he was walking away from the midway, with what looked like a small child's hand in his. But it was the photographer's stamp on the back of the contact sheet that made Aaron's blood run cold. The photos had been taken by Fletcher Photography, the studio owned by Dr. James Fletcher's younger brother, Michael, the same Dr. Fletcher who'd been driving slowly past Murphy's pawnshop just days earlier. Aaron sat in his living room, staring at the contact sheet and trying to piece together what it meant. Had Michael Fletcher been documenting the network's activities? Had he been blackmailing them? Or had he been part of the conspiracy from the beginning? Michael Fletcher had died in a car accident in 1987, just 4 years after Tommy's disappearance. At the time, it had seemed like a tragic coincidence. A young photographer killed when his car skidded off a rain-slicked road late one night. But now Aaron wondered if it had really been an accident at all. The more Aaron thought about it, the more convinced he became that Michael Fletcher had been killed to keep him quiet. Maybe he'd tried to blackmail the wrong people, or maybe he'd threatened to go to the police. Either way, his death had been convenient for everyone involved in the network, but Michael had been smart enough to hide evidence before he died. The contact sheet had somehow ended up in the town archives, probably placed there by someone who knew its significance. Maybe Michael had given it to someone he trusted, someone who'd made sure it would eventually be found. Aaron made copies of the contact sheet and hid the original in his safety deposit box at the bank. Then he started making phone calls. He needed to track down anyone who might have information about Michael Fletcher's death, anyone who might know what really happened that night in 1987. The first person he called was Janet Morrison, the widow of Detective Frank Morrison, who'd originally investigated Tommy's disappearance. Frank had died of cancer 3 years earlier, but Janet was still alive and living in a nursing home on the other side of town. Aaron found her in the facility's common room, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and a mind that was still crystal clear despite her 86 years. When he showed her the contact sheet and explained what he'd discovered, her expression grew grim. Frank always suspected there was more to that case than met the eye, she said, studying the photographs through a magnifying glass. He used to come home frustrated, talking about how the investigation kept hitting dead ends, how witnesses would change their stories or suddenly refuse to cooperate. Did he ever mention Michael Fletcher? Aaron asked. Janet nodded slowly. Oh, yes. Frank was very interested in Michael's death. He didn't believe it was an accident, thought someone had forced Michael's car off that road, but he could never prove it, and the case was ruled accidental by the state police. The state police? Aaron felt a chill. Not the local police? No, Chief Bradley insisted that the state handle the investigation, said it was too complex for local resources. Janet's eyes narrowed. Frank thought that was suspicious. Bradley had never passed up a chance to handle a high-profile case before. Aaron felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Bradley hadn't wanted local investigators looking too closely at Michael Fletcher's death because he'd known what they might find. The chief had been protecting the network even then, covering up murders to hide the larger conspiracy. Mrs. Morrison, Aaron said carefully, did your husband ever suspect that law enforcement was involved in the cover-up? Janet was quiet for a long moment, looking around the common room to make sure no one was listening. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Frank kept a private file on the case, she said. Things he couldn't put in the official reports, suspicions he couldn't prove. I still have it, hidden in my bedroom here. He made me promise to keep it safe, said someday someone might need it to get justice for those children. Aaron's heart was racing. Would you let me see it? Janet studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. Frank would have wanted the truth to come out. Follow me. Janet's room was small but comfortable, filled with photographs of her children and grandchildren. She moved slowly to the closet and pulled out a shoebox from behind her winter coats. Inside were dozens of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes, all the evidence Frank Morrison had been afraid to put in the official file. Aaron spent the next 2 hours reading through Frank's private investigation. What he found was a systematic documentation of the network's activities going back to the mid-1970s. Frank had identified at least 8 men involved in the conspiracy, including Kellerman, Murphy, and Chief Bradley. But there were others, names that shocked Aaron to his core. Mayor Richard Blackwood, who'd been a city council member back in 1983. Dr. James Fletcher, who'd provided medical care to cover up evidence of abuse. Carl Brennan, whose construction company had built the underground cells at Kellerman's farm. Frank had even documented how the network operated. They would target children at public events, county fairs, carnivals, church festivals, places where there were lots of distractions and chaos. The children would be taken to Kellerman's farm or other locations, held for varying periods of time, then killed when they became too difficult to control or too likely to be recognized. The bodies were disposed of in various ways. Some were buried on remote properties owned by network members. Others were cremated in furnaces at Brennan's construction sites. A few were dumped in deep lakes or quarries where they would never be found. The operation was protected by Chief Bradley, who made sure investigations were misdirected or abandoned. Mayor Blackwood used his political influence to discourage media attention and pressure from state authorities. Dr. Fletcher provided false medical reports when needed, and Murphy handled the disposal of evidence and souvenirs. It was a systematic, organized operation that had been claiming victims for over a decade by the time Tommy disappeared, and according to Frank's notes, it had continued operating until at least the late 1980s, when several members of the network had started dying or moving away. Aaron felt sick as he read through the documentation. Tommy hadn't just been the victim of a random predator. He'd been taken by an organized network of monsters who'd been operating in Aaron's hometown for years, protected by the very people who were supposed to keep children safe. But Frank Morrison's investigation had given Aaron something invaluable, a complete picture of how the network had operated, and enough evidence to bring down everyone involved. The question now was how to get that evidence to the right people without getting himself killed in the process. Aaron made copies of everything in Frank's file and returned the originals to Janet Morrison. Then he drove home, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He needed to get the evidence to Reynolds, but he couldn't trust normal communication channels. If Bradley was monitoring police communications, then any call Aaron made to the state police might be intercepted. Aaron decided to drive directly to the state police headquarters, about an hour away in Oklahoma City. But first he needed to make sure the evidence would survive, even if something happened to him. He made multiple copies of everything and hid them in different locations: his safety deposit box, his classroom at school, even taped under the spare tire in his car. As Aaron was preparing to leave for Oklahoma City, his phone rang. It was Reynolds, finally returning his call from that morning. "Aaron, I'm sorry I missed your call earlier," she said. "I heard about the note someone left at your house. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Aaron said, "but I found something else, something big. I need to show you evidence that's going to blow this case wide open." "What kind of evidence?" Aaron looked around his house, suddenly paranoid that someone might be listening to his phone calls. "I can't talk about it over the phone. Can you meet me somewhere? Somewhere private?" Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "Aaron, I need to tell you something. We've had some developments in the case. Kellerman was found dead in his cell this morning." Aaron felt the world tilt around him. "Dead? How?" "Apparent suicide. He hanged himself with a bedsheet sometime during the night. But Aaron, there's something suspicious about it. The guards say they checked on him just an hour before he was found, and he seemed fine. And he was supposed to give us more names today. was supposed to tell us about the other members of the network. Aaron sank into a chair, understanding immediately what had happened. He didn't kill himself, he said. They got to him. The network found a way to silence him before he could expose everyone. That's what we're thinking too, which means everyone involved is going to be even more desperate to cover their tracks now. Aaron, I think you're in real danger. These people have killed to protect their secret before, and they'll do it again. Aaron thought about the evidence he'd found, about Frank Morrison's documentation of murders going back decades. I have to show you what I found, he said. It's bigger than we thought, Reynolds, much bigger. Where are you now? At home, but I was about to drive to Oklahoma City, to the state police headquarters. No, Reynolds said quickly. Don't come here. If they're monitoring your movements, that would be the most obvious place for them to intercept you. Meet me tonight, somewhere public but not obvious. Do you know the truck stop on I-40, about 20 miles east of town? Aaron knew the place. It was busy enough that they wouldn't be alone, but far enough from Blanchard that they were unlikely to run into anyone who might report back to the network. I'll be there at 9 o'clock, Aaron said. Aaron, be careful. Vary your route, watch for anyone following you, and if anything feels wrong, just drive straight to the nearest police station, but not in Blanchard. Go to a different jurisdiction. After Reynolds hung up, Aaron gathered all the evidence he'd found and prepared to leave. But as he was loading the documents into his car, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The blue pickup truck was parked across the street again, engine running, the same man behind the wheel. But this time, Aaron could see that the man was talking on a cell phone, probably reporting Aaron's movements to someone else. Aaron forced himself to act normally, to finish loading his car without showing any sign that he'd noticed the surveillance. But his mind was racing. If they were watching him this closely, if they were coordinating his movements, then they might be planning to intercept him before he could reach Reynolds. Aaron got in his car and started driving toward the highway, checking his rearview mirror constantly. The blue pickup pulled out behind him, staying a few cars back but matching his speed exactly. Aaron tried taking a few random turns to see if the truck would follow, and it did. They weren't just watching him anymore, they were hunting him. Aaron realized he had two choices. He could try to lose the tail and make it to his meeting with Reynolds, risking a confrontation on a dark highway, or he could abandon the meeting and try to find somewhere safe to hide until help arrived. But as Aaron approached the city limits, he saw that the choice had been made for him. There were two more vehicles waiting at the intersection ahead, a black SUV and a white sedan, both with their engines running and their occupants watching Aaron's approach. Aaron was being herded into a trap, surrounded by people who had already killed to protect their secrets, people who wouldn't hesitate to kill again. In desperation, Aaron grabbed his cell phone and tried to call Reynolds, but there was no signal. They were jamming his phone, cutting off his communication with the outside world. Aaron was completely alone, trapped by the same network that had taken his brother 21 years earlier. And unless he could find a way out of this trap, he was about to become their latest victim. But Aaron had one advantage that Tommy hadn't had. He knew what he was up against, and he wasn't going down without a fight. Aaron slammed on his brakes and yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending his car skidding into the parking lot of an abandoned gas station. The blue pickup overshot the turn, its driver caught off guard by Aaron's sudden move. Aaron floored the accelerator and shot out the back of the parking lot, tires screaming as he raced down a side road he'd traveled countless times as a teenager. He knew these back roads better than his pursuers did. That was his only advantage now. Aaron took a series of sharp turns, cutting through residential neighborhoods and farm roads, checking his mirrors constantly. He'd managed to lose the pickup truck, but he could see headlights in the distance that might belong to the black SUV. Aaron's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, adrenaline coursing through his system. He needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere public, but he couldn't risk leading the network to Reynolds. More importantly, he needed to make sure the evidence survived even if he didn't. Aaron pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, a place called Betty's that had been serving truckers and insomniacs for 30 years. It was brightly lit and busy enough that no one would try anything violent, at least not immediately. Aaron parked close to the front door and hurried inside, carrying the bag of evidence with him. The diner was half full, mostly long-haul truckers grabbing coffee and pie before hitting the road again. Aaron chose a booth near the back, with a clear view of the parking lot, and ordered coffee he didn't want. His phone still had no signal, which meant they were still jamming communications somehow. But the diner had a payphone near the restrooms, an ancient relic that might still work. Aaron left the evidence bag in his booth and walked casually to the phone, fishing quarters from his pocket. The line was dead. They'd thought of everything. Aaron returned to his booth, his mind racing. He needed to get word to Reynolds, needed to let her know what was happening. But more than that, he needed to make sure Frank Morrison's documentation reached the right people. Too many children had died for this evidence to disappear now. Aaron looked around the diner, studying the other customers. The truckers seemed legitimate, focused on their food and their route schedules. But there was one man sitting alone at the counter who seemed out of place. He was wearing a suit instead of work clothes, drinking coffee but not eating, and he kept glancing toward Aaron's booth. Aaron forced himself to stay calm. He opened the evidence bag and pulled out Frank Morrison's file, along with the contact sheet and copies of all the documents he'd found. Then he did something that felt crazy, but might save his life. Aaron approached the trucker in the booth closest to his, a large man with a grey beard, who was working his way through a piece of apple pie. "Excuse me," Aaron said quietly. "I need to ask you a huge favor, and I know this is going to sound insane." The trucker looked up, studying Aaron's face. "You okay, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm a teacher here in town," Aaron said, sitting down across from the trucker. "My name is Aaron Blake. I'm being followed by some very dangerous people, and I need to get this evidence to the state police." He placed the bag on the table between them. The trucker's expression grew serious. "What kind of evidence?" Aaron quickly explained about Tommy's disappearance, about the camera and the photographs, about the network of men who'd been taking children for decades. The trucker listened without interruption, occasionally glancing toward the man at the counter. "I see him," the trucker said when Aaron mentioned his suspicions about the man in the suit. "Been watching you since you came in. Name's Jake Patterson, by the way." He extended a calloused hand. "Jake, I need you to take this evidence and drive it to the state police headquarters in Oklahoma City. Tell them it's for investigator Janet Reynolds. Tell them it's about the Blake case. This documentation could bring down everyone involved, but only if it reaches the right people." Jake studied Aaron's face for a long moment. "You're serious about this, aren't you? This isn't some kind of scam or practical joke." "I wish it were," Aaron said. "But my little brother disappeared 21 years ago, and I just found out he was killed by a network of people who are still operating, still protected by local law enforcement. They've already killed one man in jail to keep him quiet, and I think they're planning to kill me next." Jake nodded grimly. "I've got kids of my own," he said. "Grandkids too. Give me the bag." Aaron handed over the evidence, feeling a mixture of relief and terror. "There's one more thing. Can I use your cell phone? Mine's not working." Jake handed over his phone, and Aaron quickly dialed Reynolds' number. To his relief, the call went through immediately. "Reynolds, it's Aaron Blake. I'm in trouble. They were waiting for me when I tried to leave town, tried to trap me with multiple vehicles. I'm at Betty's Diner on Route 9, but I don't think I can stay here much longer." "Jesus, Aaron, are you hurt?" "Not yet, but I gave the evidence to someone I trust, someone who's going to drive it to you in Oklahoma City. All of Frank Morrison's files plus contact sheets from the 1983 fair that show the network in action." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "Frank Morrison, the original detective on Tommy's case? He kept a private file on everything he couldn't prove officially. Names, dates, methods of operation. It documents the entire network going back to the mid-1970s. Reynolds, this thing is massive. At least 8 men involved, including Chief Bradley, Mayor Blackwood, and Dr. Fletcher." "Holy shit," Reynolds breathed. "Aaron, you need to get out of there now. Don't go home, don't go anywhere predictable. Find somewhere public and stay there until we can get to you." "I'll try. But Reynolds, if something happens to me, make sure that evidence gets to the FBI. Don't trust anyone from local law enforcement. Bradley's been protecting this network for decades." Aaron hung up and handed the phone back to Jake, who was already standing and putting on his jacket. "I'm leaving now," Jake said. "Should be in Oklahoma City in about 2 hours. You watch yourself, son, and if you need to get out of here fast, my truck's the red Peterbilt with the eagle on the side." Aaron watched Jake leave, feeling slightly better knowing the evidence was in good hands, but his relief was short-lived. As soon as Jake's truck pulled out of the parking lot, the man in the suit got up from the counter and walked toward Aaron's booth. "Mr. Blake," the man said, sliding into the seat across from Aaron. "My name is Detective Carl Brennan, Jr. I think we need to talk." Aaron's blood ran cold. Brennan, the same last name as the construction company owner who'd built the cells at Kellerman's farm. This man wasn't a detective at all. He was probably the son of one of the network members. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," Aaron said, starting to stand. Brennan grabbed Aaron's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Sit down," he said quietly. "You're going to listen to what I have to say, and then you're going to make a very important decision." Aaron sat back down, his heart pounding. He glanced around the diner, but no one seemed to be paying attention to their conversation. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Mr. Blake," Brennan continued, asking questions, digging up old files, bringing in outside investigators. "Some people think you should have left well enough alone. Some people are child killers," Aaron said. Brennan's expression didn't change. "That's one way to look at it. Another way is that some people were providing a service, taking care of a problem that society prefers not to acknowledge." Aaron felt sick. "A service? You're talking about murdering children." "I'm talking about removing undesirable elements from society," Brennan said calmly. "Children who would have grown up to be problems anyway. Runaways, troublemakers, kids from broken homes who were already on the wrong path." Aaron stared at the man across from him, struggling to comprehend the level of evil he was witnessing. This wasn't just about sick predators acting on their urges. This was about people who had convinced themselves that they were performing some kind of social service by killing children. "You're insane," Aaron whispered. Brennan shrugged. "I'm practical, and right now I'm offering you a chance to be practical too. You can walk away from this investigation, stop talking to the state police, and go back to your quiet life as a teacher. In exchange, you get to live. And if I refuse?" Brennan's smile was cold. "Well, let's just say that teachers have been known to have accidents. Car crashes, house fires, hunting mishaps. Tragic, but these things happen." Aaron thought about Tommy, about all the other children who died because good people had chosen to look the other way. He thought about Frank Morrison, a cop who'd been brave enough to document the truth even when he couldn't act on it. He thought about Janet Reynolds, who was risking her career to pursue justice. "No," Aaron said quietly. Brennan's expression hardened. "I'm sorry to hear that. I really hoped you'd be more reasonable." Brennan started to reach inside his jacket, but Aaron was ready for him. 20 years of working with high school students had given Aaron quick reflexes, and he'd been a wrestler in college. Aaron grabbed the coffee pot from the table and smashed it across Brennan's face, sending hot coffee and ceramic shards flying. Brennan screamed and fell backward, clutching his face. Aaron ran toward the front of the diner, shouting for someone to call 911, but as he reached the door, he saw that the parking lot was full of vehicles that hadn't been there before. Black SUVs, pickup trucks, cars with tinted windows. They'd surrounded the diner while Aaron was talking to Brennan. There was no way out. Aaron turned back toward the interior of the diner, looking for another exit. The kitchen had a back door, but he'd have to get past Brennan, who was struggling to his feet with blood streaming down his face. The other customers in the diner were starting to realize something was wrong. A few were pulling out their phones, but Aaron doubted they'd be able to get calls through. The truckers were looking around nervously, and one older woman was heading toward the door. "Don't go outside," Aaron called to her. "Call the state police. Tell them Aaron Blake needs help at Betty's Diner on Route 9. Brennan was on his feet now, pulling a gun from inside his jacket. "Everyone on the ground," he shouted. "Now!" The diner erupted in chaos. Customers dove under tables, the waitress screamed, and someone in the kitchen started shouting about calling the police. Aaron used the confusion to slip behind the counter, heading for the kitchen and the back exit. He made it to the kitchen door before Brennan spotted him. "Stop right there, Blake," Brennan called, his voice distorted by his broken nose and the blood in his mouth. Aaron ignored him and pushed through the kitchen door. The cook, a large woman named Betty, who'd been running the place since Aaron was in high school, looked up in surprise. "Aaron, what in the hell is going on out there?" "Call the state police," Aaron said, heading for the back door. "Tell them to send everything they have." Aaron burst through the back door and found himself in an alley behind the diner. For a moment, he thought he might have found an escape route. But then he saw the black SUV parked at the end of the alley, blocking his path. 2 men got out of the SUV, both carrying guns. Aaron recognized one of them immediately, Chief Bradley, still in his police uniform, but clearly not there in any official capacity. "Hello, Aaron," Bradley said, walking slowly down the alley. "I tried to warn you to leave this alone. I tried to give you a chance to walk away. But you just couldn't help yourself, could you? Aaron backed against the wall of the diner, trapped between Bradley and the men behind him. It's over, Bradley. The evidence is already on its way to the state police. They know about the network, know about your involvement. Bradley shook his head sadly. No, Aaron, it's not over. Because that evidence is never going to reach the state police, and neither are you. Bradley raised his gun, pointing it directly at Aaron's chest. I want you to know that this isn't personal. You seem like a good kid, a good teacher, but you've seen too much, know too much, and some secrets are worth killing for. Aaron closed his eyes, thinking of Tommy, thinking of all the children who died because men like Bradley had protected their killers. At least the evidence was safe. At least Reynolds would know the truth. But then Aaron heard something that made him open his eyes, the sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer. Bradley heard them too. His expression changed from confidence to concern to fear in the space of a few seconds. How? He demanded. We jammed all the phones, cut the landlines. Aaron smiled grimly. Truckers have CB radios, he said. And Jake Patterson has been on the radio for the last 20 minutes, telling every trucker in 3 states that there's a cop in trouble at Betty's Diner. The sirens were getting closer now, and Aaron could see flashing lights reflecting off the buildings at the end of the alley. Bradley looked around desperately, realizing that his carefully planned ambush was falling apart. This isn't over, he said, backing toward the SUV. You have no idea how deep this goes, how many people are involved. You think you've won, but you've just made yourself a target for life. Bradley and his men retreated to their vehicles and disappeared into the night, but Aaron knew this was just the beginning. The network had been exposed, but it wasn't destroyed, and now Aaron was the man who could identify everyone involved. The state police arrived within minutes, led by Janet Reynolds herself. Aaron had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. Are you hurt? She asked, examining the cuts on Aaron's face from the broken coffee pot. I'm fine, Aaron said, but Bradley was here, along with at least 6 other men. They were going to kill me, Reynolds. They would have killed me if not for the truckers. Reynolds nodded grimly. We're going to get them, Aaron, all of them. The evidence you sent with Jake Patterson is incredible. It's going to bring down the entire network. But as Aaron sat in the back of a state police car, giving his statement about the night's events, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Bradley had been right about one thing. Aaron had no idea how deep this conspiracy went, how many people were involved, how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. The network had been operating for over 30 years, had killed dozens of children, had corrupted law enforcement and local government. Men like that didn't just give up when they were exposed. They fought back, and their next target was going to be Aaron Blake. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in a suburb of Oklahoma City, the kind of place that looked like every other house on the block. Aaron had been there for 3 days now, under the protection of the FBI, watching the news coverage of the biggest scandal in Oklahoma history unfold on television. The arrests had started the morning after the confrontation at Betty's Diner. Chief Bradley had been taken into custody at his home, along with Mayor Blackwood and Dr. Fletcher. Carl Brennan Sr. had been arrested at a construction site, and 3 other men whose names Aaron recognized from Frank Morrison's files had been picked up across the state. But the media coverage was only telling part of the story. The reporters were calling it a child trafficking ring, focusing on the sensational aspects of the case while missing the deeper implications. They didn't understand that this wasn't just about a few sick men acting on their urges. This was about a systematic operation that had corrupted an entire community. FBI Special Agent Linda Vasquez sat across from Aaron at the kitchen table, reviewing the mountain of evidence they'd accumulated. She was a woman in her 40s with short, dark hair and the kind of intense focus that came from years of investigating the worst crimes humanity could produce. We've identified at least 42 victims over a 30-year period, she told Aaron. Children taken from fairs, carnivals, and other public events across 5 states. The forensic evidence from Kellerman's farm and other locations is overwhelming. Aaron looked at the photographs spread across the table, school pictures of children who would never grow up, faces that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Tommy was among them, smiling in his 2nd-grade class photo. What about the people who are still alive? Aaron asked. The network members who haven't been arrested yet. Vasquez's expression darkened. That's the problem. Based on Frank Morrison's documentation and what we've learned from the arrested suspects, we believe there are at least 12 people involved in this network, We've only arrested 7. Aaron felt a chill. Which means 5 are still out there, including some of the most dangerous ones. The financial backers, the people who provided transportation, the ones who helped dispose of evidence. And Aaron, we have reason to believe that some of these people have connections outside of Oklahoma. This network may have been part of something much larger. The implications of what Vasquez was saying hit Aaron like a physical blow. He'd thought they were dealing with a local conspiracy, horrible but contained. But if the network had connections to similar operations in other states, if this was part of a national organization, then the scope of the crimes was almost unimaginable. How many children are we talking about? Aaron asked quietly. We don't know yet. Could be hundreds. Could be more. Aaron stared out the window of the safe house, watching normal people live their normal lives in a world that suddenly seemed much darker and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Children were playing in the yard next door, riding bicycles and laughing, unaware that there were monsters in the world who saw them as prey. There's something else, Vasquez said. Something we haven't released to the media yet. When we searched Mayor Blackwood's house, we found a safe in his basement. Inside were financial records going back to the early 1980s, documenting payments to various members of the network. Aaron looked up from the photographs. Payments for what? Services rendered, transportation, disposal, silence. This operation was more than just a group of predators, Aaron. It was a business. Children were being bought and sold, traded between different groups, transported across state lines for specific purposes. The room felt like it was spinning around Aaron. You're talking about human trafficking, on a massive scale. And the financial records suggest that this particular network was just one branch of a much larger organization, an organization that's been operating for decades, that has members in law enforcement, government, business, even the clergy. Aaron thought about his quiet hometown, about the people he'd grown up trusting and respecting. How many of them had known what was happening? How many had chosen to look the other way because it was easier than confronting the truth? And what happens now? Aaron asked. Now we follow the money trail and see where it leads. But Aaron, I need to warn you about something. The people who are still free, the ones at the top of this organization, they're not going to just disappear quietly. They have too much to lose, too many secrets to protect. As if summoned by her words, Vasquez's phone rang. She answered it with a curt Vasquez, then listened for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly grim. When? She asked. How many? Another pause. Jesus Christ, we'll be right there. Vasquez hung up and turned to Aaron, her face pale. There's been an incident in Blanchard. Someone firebombed the town hall, destroying most of the records in the basement archives. Margaret Fielding was working late, trying to organize the old files for the investigation. She's in critical condition with severe burns. Aaron felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Margaret Fielding, the elderly woman who'd helped him find the vendor application for the ring toss booth, who'd spent her life serving her community. She was fighting for her life because she'd tried to help him find the truth. They're trying to destroy the evidence, Aaron said, and eliminate witnesses. Aaron, we're moving you to a different location. This safe house may be compromised. Within an hour, Aaron was in the back of an unmarked FBI van, being transported to a new location. But as they drove through the Oklahoma countryside, Vasquez received another call that made her order the driver to pull over immediately. Janet Morrison is dead, she told Aaron after hanging up, found in her room at the nursing home. Apparent heart attack, but the timing is suspicious. The staff said she'd been agitated all day, kept talking about men who'd been asking questions about her late husband's files. Aaron felt the walls closing in around him. The people who'd helped him, who'd provided the evidence that broke the case open, were being systematically eliminated. Margaret Fielding was fighting for her life, Janet Morrison was dead, and Aaron was beginning to understand that he might never be safe again. How did they find out about Mrs. Morrison? Aaron asked. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. There's something we haven't told you. When we arrested Chief Bradley, we found surveillance equipment in his office. Listening devices, camera feeds, communication intercepts. He'd been monitoring state police communications for months, maybe years. The implications were staggering. Bradley had known about Reynolds' investigation from the beginning, had been feeding information to the network about every development in the case. The network had always been one step ahead because they'd had someone inside law enforcement telling them exactly what the investigators were doing. That means they know about this safe house, Aaron said. They know about the evidence we found. They know about the arrests we're planning. That's why we're moving you again. But Aaron, there's something else. The surveillance equipment in Bradley's office was sophisticated, expensive. This isn't the kind of gear a small-town police chief could afford on his salary. Someone with serious resources was funding this operation. The new safe house was a cabin in the mountains of Arkansas, isolated and heavily guarded by federal agents. Aaron spent the next week there, watching the investigation unfold on television and through briefings from Vasquez and her team. The news was a mixture of progress and setbacks. More arrests had been made based on Frank Morrison's documentation, but several suspects had fled before they could be apprehended. Financial records had revealed a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts, but tracing the money was proving difficult. Most frustratingly, the investigation kept hitting roadblocks. Evidence would disappear from police storage facilities. Witnesses would recant their statements or suddenly refuse to cooperate. Computer files would be mysteriously corrupted or deleted. It's like fighting a hydra, Vasquez told Aaron during one of their evening briefings. Every time we cut off one head, two more appear, and every move we make seems to be anticipated by the people we're hunting. Aaron was beginning to understand that the network's survival wasn't just about individual criminals protecting themselves. This was about an organization that had spent decades infiltrating legitimate institutions, placing their people in positions of power and influence. How do we fight something like that? Aaron asked. Very carefully, and by trusting no one outside of our immediate team. Aaron, we've made a decision. We're going public with everything we know, holding a press conference to release all the evidence we've gathered. It's the only way to protect the investigation from further interference. The press conference was scheduled for the following Monday. Aaron would be there, along with Reynolds and other key investigators, to present the full scope of the network's crimes to the media and the public. It was a risk, exposing Aaron to potential retaliation, but it was also their best chance of ensuring that the truth couldn't be suppressed. But on Sunday night, Aaron received a phone call that changed everything. The caller's voice was electronically distorted, impossible to identify. "Mr. Blake," the voice said, "I think it's time we had a conversation." "Who is this?" Aaron asked, though he already had a terrible suspicion. "I'm someone who's been watching your investigation with great interest, someone who knows things about your brother's disappearance that you haven't discovered yet." Aaron's heart was pounding. "What things?" "Your brother didn't die in 1983, Mr. Blake. Tommy Blake is still alive." Aaron felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. "That's impossible. We found his shirt. We found remains at Kellerman's farm. You found what we wanted you to find. But Tommy was special, Mr. Blake. Too valuable to waste. He was sold to people who had specific requirements, people who were willing to pay a premium for a boy with his particular qualities." Aaron couldn't breathe. The idea that Tommy might still be alive, might have spent the last 21 years in captivity, was almost too horrible to contemplate. "I don't believe you," Aaron whispered. "I thought you might say that. Check your email, Mr. Blake. I've sent you something that will change your mind." Aaron opened his laptop with shaking hands and found a new message in his inbox. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank, but the attachment made Aaron's world stop spinning. It was a photograph, clearly taken recently based on the digital quality. It showed a man in his late 20s with dark hair and familiar features, standing in what looked like a warehouse or industrial building. The man was thin, almost gaunt, with the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen too much suffering. But despite the years and the obvious trauma, Aaron recognized the face immediately. It was Tommy, 21 years older, damaged and changed, but definitely his little brother. "Now do I have your attention?" the voice asked. Aaron was crying, staring at the photograph of his brother, who should have been dead but was somehow impossibly still alive. "Where is he?" "That depends entirely on you, Mr. Blake. You're going to call off tomorrow's press conference. You're going to stop cooperating with the FBI investigation, and you're going to convince the authorities to drop all charges against the people they've arrested." "That's impossible. I can't do that." "Oh, but you can, because if you don't, your brother dies. And this time, Mr. Blake, he'll stay dead." Aaron closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice crushing down on him. He'd spent 21 years trying to find out what happened to Tommy, had finally uncovered the truth about the network that took him, but now that truth was being used as a weapon against him. How do I know you'll really release him if I do what you want? Aaron asked. You don't. But you know what will happen if you don't. The press conference is in 12 hours, Mr. Blake, I suggest you start making some phone calls. The line went dead, leaving Aaron alone with the photograph of his brother and an impossible decision. Save Tommy and let the network escape justice, or pursue justice and condemn his brother to death. But as Aaron stared at the photograph, he noticed something the caller probably hadn't intended him to see. In the background, partially obscured by shadow, was a sign on the wall. Aaron enhanced the image on his laptop, adjusting the contrast and brightness until he could make out the words. It was a company logo. Brennan Construction, building tomorrow today. The same construction company that had built the cells at Kellerman's farm, which meant Tommy was being held somewhere connected to the network, somewhere Aaron might be able to find. Aaron had a choice to make. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to save his brother and bring down the network at the same time. The question was whether he could do it before tomorrow's deadline, and whether Tommy would survive long enough to be rescued. Aaron didn't sleep that night. He sat in the cabin's living room, staring at the photograph of Tommy while his mind raced through possibilities. The Brennan Construction logo in the background was his only clue, but it was enough. The company owned dozens of properties across 3 counties: warehouses, storage facilities, construction sites, abandoned buildings they'd purchased for renovation. At dawn, Aaron made his decision. He couldn't call off the press conference and let the network escape justice. Too many children had died, too many families had been destroyed, but he also couldn't abandon Tommy after learning his brother had been alive all these years. Aaron called Vasquez and told her about the phone call, the photograph, and his plan. Her reaction was immediate and predictable. "Absolutely not," she said. "Aaron, this is obviously a trap. They're using your brother to manipulate you into destroying the investigation." "Maybe," Aaron said, "but what if it's real? What if Tommy really is alive and I'm his only chance? Then we'll find him through proper channels. We'll investigate every Brennan Construction property. Bring in search teams, do this the right way." "There isn't time. The press conference is in 6 hours. If I don't show up, if I don't convince you to drop the charges, they'll kill him." Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. "Aaron, even if we wanted to drop the charges, we couldn't. This is a federal investigation now, involving multiple states and dozens of victims. It's bigger than any one person, even your brother." Aaron had expected that answer, but it still felt like a knife in his chest. The system that was supposed to protect people like Tommy was the same system that might prevent his rescue. "Then I'm going alone," Aaron said. "Like hell you are. Aaron, I'm ordering you to stay in that cabin. We have federal agents posted outside, and they have instructions not to let you leave." Aaron hung up and looked out the window. Sure enough, there were 2 black SUVs parked on the road leading to the cabin, and he could see agents stationed at various points around the property. They were protecting him, but they were also keeping him prisoner. Aaron spent the next hour studying maps of Brennan Construction properties on his laptop. Most were in developed areas, where Tommy couldn't be held without drawing attention. But there were several isolated facilities: an old quarry outside of town, a defunct cement plant, a warehouse complex near the airport. The warehouse complex seemed most likely. It was large enough to hold multiple prisoners, isolated enough to avoid detection, and according to the property records, it had been abandoned for several years. If Aaron were going to hide someone for over 2 decades, that's where he'd do it. But first, Aaron had to get past the federal agents guarding him. Aaron remembered something from his wrestling days in college. He'd learned that sometimes the best way to escape a hold was to do something unexpected, something your opponent wasn't prepared for. The agents outside were expecting him to try to sneak out, to find a secret exit or distract them somehow. Instead, Aaron walked out the front door and approached the nearest agent directly. "I need to make a statement for the press conference," he told the agent, a young man named Peterson. "Agent Vasquez wants me to practice my testimony in front of a camera." Peterson looked confused. "I wasn't told about any camera crew." "They're not here yet," Aaron said, "but I need to drive into town to meet them at the FBI field office." "Vasquez said you'd escort me." Peterson was clearly uncertain about this development, but he also didn't want to interfere with what might be legitimate FBI business. "Let me call this in," he said, reaching for his radio. Aaron waited until Peterson was distracted by his radio conversation, then sprinted toward the woods behind the cabin. He heard Peterson shouting behind him. heard other agents responding, but Aaron had a head start, and he knew these mountains better than they did. Aaron had spent summers here as a kid, hiking and camping with his father and Tommy. He knew the trail system, knew which paths led to old logging roads, knew where he could find the ancient jeep trail that connected to the highway 5 miles away. It took Aaron 2 hours to reach the highway, emerging from the woods dirty and exhausted, but free. He hitchhiked into the nearest town and used cash to buy a cheap cell phone and rent a car under a false name. By noon, he was driving toward the Brennan construction warehouse complex, knowing he was probably walking into a trap, but unable to abandon the possibility that Tommy was still alive. The warehouse complex was exactly what Aaron had expected, a collection of large windowless buildings surrounded by chain-link fence and overgrown with weeds. According to the GPS, it was 15 miles from the nearest neighbor and invisible from any public road. Aaron parked his rental car a mile away and approached the complex on foot, using the tree line for cover. The main gate was chained shut, but the fence had several gaps where someone could slip through. Aaron chose a spot where the fence had been cut and partially repaired, suggesting recent use. The first 3 warehouses appeared to be genuinely abandoned, filled with rusted machinery and debris. But the 4th building was different. The windows had been blacked out, and there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt outside. Most tellingly, Aaron could hear the hum of a generator running somewhere inside. Aaron circled the building, looking for a way in. The main doors were locked, but there was a loading dock in the back with a door that had been left slightly ajar. Aaron slipped inside, finding himself in a vast space filled with shipping containers and construction equipment. But it was the sounds that made Aaron's blood run cold. Somewhere in the building he could hear voices, adult voices giving orders, and the higher-pitched responses of what sounded like children. Aaron moved deeper into the warehouse, following the sounds. What he found defied every nightmare he'd imagined about what had happened to Tommy. The back section of the warehouse had been converted into a series of living spaces, crude but functional rooms separated by plywood walls. Aaron could see at least a dozen children and young adults, ranging in age from about 10 to their early 20s. They were thin and pale, with the hollow-eyed look of people who'd been held captive for years. And there, in a room at the end of the corridor, was Tommy. Aaron's brother was sitting on a cot, staring at the wall with the empty expression of someone whose spirit had been broken long ago. He looked exactly like the photograph Aaron had received, gaunt and damaged, but unmistakably Tommy Blake. Aaron approached the room carefully, not wanting to startle his brother or alert any guards who might be nearby. When he reached the doorway, Tommy looked up and their eyes met for the first time in 21 years. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Tommy's expression changed from emptiness to confusion, to recognition, to something that might have been hope. "Aaron?" Tommy whispered, his voice hoarse from years of disuse. Aaron stepped into the room and knelt beside his brother, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here, Tommy. I'm going to get you out of here." Tommy reached out with a shaking hand and touched Aaron's face as if he couldn't believe this was real. "I knew you'd come," he said. "I always knew you'd find me." Aaron hugged his brother, feeling how thin he'd become, how fragile. "Can you walk?" "Are you hurt?" "I can walk," Tommy said. "But Aaron, there are others. We can't leave them here." Aaron looked around the makeshift prison, seeing the faces of children who'd been stolen from their families, just like Tommy had been. Some were recent arrivals, still showing signs of fight and fear. Others had the same broken look as Tommy, resigned to their captivity. "How many guards are there?" Aaron asked. "Usually just 2 during the day," Tommy said. "But, Aaron, they have cameras, alarms. They'll know we're trying to escape before we get halfway out." Aaron was already pulling out his new cell phone, trying to call the FBI, but there was no signal. They were too far from any cell towers, or the warehouse was equipped with jammers. Aaron heard footsteps approaching and quickly pulled Tommy behind a partition. 2 men were walking through the warehouse, conducting what seemed to be a routine patrol. Aaron recognized one of them immediately. Carl Brennan Jr., the man who'd threatened him at Betty's diner. "The buyer's coming tonight," Brennan was saying to his companion. "We need to have the 3 youngest ones ready for transport." Aaron felt sick. They weren't just holding these children, they were selling them to other predators. This warehouse was a distribution center for human trafficking, and the children were merchandise. Aaron waited until the guards had passed, then turned back to Tommy. "We're getting everyone out of here," he said. "Right now." Aaron quickly moved through the makeshift prison, quietly waking the other captives and explaining that help had arrived. Most of the children were too frightened to trust him immediately, but Tommy's presence seemed to reassure them. If Tommy trusted this stranger, then maybe they could too. The escape plan was simple, but dangerous. Aaron would create a distraction at the front of the warehouse, while the children escaped through the loading dock where he'd entered. Tommy, despite his condition, insisted on helping coordinate the evacuation. Aaron found the warehouse's electrical panel and shut off the main power, plunging the building into darkness. Immediately he heard shouts from the guards and the sound of footsteps running toward the electrical room. Aaron used the confusion to guide the first group of children toward the loading dock. Tommy was helping the younger ones, carrying a 6-year-old girl who was too weak to walk on her own. Aaron had never been more proud of his brother, but as they reached the loading dock, Aaron heard the worst sound possible, the roar of multiple vehicles approaching the warehouse. Reinforcements were arriving, probably called when the power went out. "Go," Aaron told Tommy, pushing him toward the door. "Get the children to the tree line and keep going. There's a road about a mile north. Flag down any car you see and tell them to call the FBI." "What about you?" Tommy asked. "I'm going to buy you some time." Aaron kissed his brother's forehead, the same way he used to when Tommy was 7 years old and afraid of the dark. "I love you, Tommy. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you." Tommy hugged him fiercely. "I love you too. And Aaron? I never blamed you, not once in 21 years. Aaron watched his brother disappear into the darkness with the other survivors, then turned back toward the warehouse. He could hear the guards searching for them, could see flashlight beams sweeping through the building. Aaron had one more card to play. He still had the original evidence from Frank Morrison's files in his jacket pocket, copies of the most damning documents proving the network's existence. If he could get those documents to the right people, even if he didn't survive the night, the investigation would continue. Aaron made his way to the warehouse office, where he'd seen a fax machine earlier. He started feeding pages into the machine, sending copies of Frank Morrison's evidence to every law enforcement agency and news organization he could think of. But before he could finish, the lights came back on, and Aaron found himself facing Carl Brennan, Jr. and 3 other men, all armed. Well, Brennan said, his face still bearing scars from their encounter at the diner. "Aaron Blake, the persistent teacher. You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Aaron continued feeding pages into the fax machine, even as the men approached him. "It's over, Brennan. The evidence is already out there. The whole world is going to know what you people have been doing." Brennan smiled coldly. "The evidence doesn't matter without witnesses to authenticate it, and there aren't going to be any witnesses." Aaron fed the last page into the fax machine and turned to face his captors. "There are a dozen children who just escaped this warehouse. They're witnesses, they're survivors, and they're going to testify against every one of you." For the first time, Brennan looked uncertain. "Where are they?" "Gone," Aaron said. "And by now, the FBI knows exactly where to find you." As if summoned by Aaron's words, the warehouse suddenly filled with the sound of helicopters overhead and vehicles surrounding the building. Powerful spotlights illuminated the warehouse, and a voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is the FBI. The building is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." Brennan and his men looked around desperately, realizing their operation had been completely exposed. Aaron felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that Tommy and the other children were safe, that the evidence had reached the right people. But Brennan wasn't finished. He raised his gun and pointed it at Aaron's chest. "Maybe I can't stop the investigation," he said, "but I can still kill the man who started it." Aaron closed his eyes, thinking of Tommy's face when they'd been reunited, thinking of all the children who would now have a chance to go home to their families. He'd kept his promise to find his brother, had exposed the network that had destroyed so many lives. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space of the warehouse. But when Aaron opened his eyes, he was still standing. Carl Brennan, Jr. was on the ground, clutching his shoulder and screaming in pain. Janet Reynolds stepped out of the shadows, her FBI badge visible and her gun still trained on Brennan. "Aaron Blake," she said with a slight smile, "you are under arrest for interfering with a federal investigation, escaping protective custody, and being the most stubborn man I've ever met." Aaron laughed, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "I'll take those charges," he said. The FBI raid of the warehouse complex led to the arrest of 17 people and the rescue of 19 victims, some of whom had been held captive for over a decade. The evidence Aaron had faxed to news organizations was broadcast around the world, exposing a human trafficking network that had operated for over 30 years. Chief Bradley, Mayor Blackwood, and the other arrested network members were convicted on federal charges and sentenced to life in prison. The investigation led to similar raids in 6 other states, ultimately bringing down an organization that had claimed hundreds of victims. But for Aaron, the most important outcome was watching Tommy take his first steps back into the world. His brother faced years of therapy and recovery, but he was alive, he was free, and he was surrounded by people who loved him. On a warm spring morning, 6 months after the warehouse raid, Aaron and Tommy stood together at their parents' grave. Tommy was healthier now, had put on weight and learned to smile again. He was living with Aaron, slowly rebuilding a life that had been stolen from him at age 7. "Do you think they know?" Tommy asked, looking down at their parents' headstone. "I think they've always known," Aaron said. "I think they've been waiting for us to find each other." Tommy nodded and placed a bouquet of flowers on the grave. "I'm sorry it took so long," he whispered. Aaron put his arm around his brother's shoulders. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said. "Nothing at all." As they walked away from the cemetery together, Aaron thought about the camera that had started it all, still sitting in an evidence locker somewhere. A simple device that had contained the key to the darkest secret their hometown had ever kept. Some people said Aaron was a hero for exposing the network, for saving his brother and the other victims. But Aaron knew better. The real heroes were the children who'd survived years of captivity and found the courage to testify against their captors. The real heroes were the investigators, like Janet Reynolds, who'd never given up on finding the truth. Aaron was just a teacher who'd bought a camera at a pawnshop and refused to stop asking questions. But sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. The Tommy Blake case was officially closed, but its impact would last for generations. New laws were passed to protect children, new protocols were established for investigating trafficking networks, and families across the country finally got answers about children who disappeared decades earlier. And in a small town in Oklahoma, a high school history teacher returned to his classroom with a story that would never make it into any textbook, because some truths are too dark, too painful, too real for the sanitized version of history we teach our children. But Aaron Blake would never forget. None of them would ever forget. And that memory, that refusal to let the past stay buried, was the greatest protection they could offer the children of the future. The camera had revealed its secrets. The network had been destroyed. The children had come home. And for the first time in 21 years, Aaron Blake could sleep peacefully, knowing his brother was safe in the next room, knowing he'd finally kept the promise he'd made to watch over Tommy all those years ago at the county fair. Some stories end with justice. Some end with redemption. This one ended with something even more precious. A family reunited, and the knowledge that sometimes, even in the darkest corners of the world, love can still find a way to bring people home.